aligned with what I'm saying, which is Bitcoin will replace the dollar. And it's going to happen very quickly. People aren't going to expect it. And everything just gets priced into sats or Bitcoin. But I believe when fiat currencies fail, they just spectacularly fail. There is no real grace period because nobody wants it anymore. Definitely, we're reaching the end of 2024 now, but 2025 is going to be the year of war to accumulate Bitcoin. Everyone's going to be trying to get it. Well, I think for Bitcoin, we're not yet primed for bigger numbers. And this is why I started promoting the M notation or million notation. Like some people call it the Mow notation, and some have called it like a Michael notation for Michael Saylor. But it's just the next logical step. So we're already talking about Bitcoin in terms of K, right? 1,000. It's not 100,000, it's 100K. So the logical extension is to go to M and then eventually, B for billion. But there is no really an upper bound for where Bitcoin will go. I believe we're going to cross this threshold. You can call it the Veblen threshold or some threshold whereby we start to demonetize other large pools of existing assets like gold, real estate, and whatnot. And then it just accelerates from there upwards. So I think that sweet spot somewhere in the 400 to 600K range. And that's when we really start to take gold market cap away from that and move it to Bitcoin. So it's really just framing Bitcoin in a way that people can understand that there is a lot of growth potential still, and to prepare them for $1 million Bitcoin and upwards, which I think some people can't see. They think, oh, well, it's grown so much. There's a diminishing return. That's a common one that people throw out there, but there is no such thing as diminishing returns when you're replacing an existing monetary system that is inferior. It just goes away and it dies. So it's not so much that I think we're going to be talking about multi-billion dollar Bitcoin. If you priced it in terms of fiat, yes. But I think once you cross the few million mark, maybe in the 5 million range, I think that's when people stop accepting fiat currencies and they just accept sats. And that just becomes the new norm. So you'll never actually get to the point where, a Bitcoin is worth $1 trillion. We're going to switch completely off the fiat standard and onto the Bitcoin standard completely by that point. And I think the other part is people have grown accustomed to these large numbers when talking about things like GDP and debt, right? It's always in the billions and trillions. But most people don't really realize, especially normal people, that these numbers are absolutely ridiculous. Like, what is $1 trillion? Do you have any physical concept of how much money that is and how much physical space that would take up if you had physical bills printed for a few $1 trillion, right? Like, it's just insane how much money that is. But it's normalized, like, okay, debt is up by $1 trillion this year. That's normal, right? So we just have to understand that Bitcoin will reprice everything. And yes, it will go up, but it's going to just be sats from now on. Like, we'll go back to more of a normal sounding price range for things. Like, you pay maybe $10 a coffee right now. That's kind of ridiculous, right? And you might be paying 10, 15 bucks for a hamburger, but your grandparents paid 15 cents for a hamburger. So once we go back to that once we go to that Bitcoin standard and we reprice to satoshis, I think, people will be earning 15 sats an hour at minimum wage, if there's still such thing as minimum wages, but everything will sound more normal and you'll have normal numbers once again.
What is your guess based on what you're seeing today of how long it takes for this next part of the transition? Like, do you think this is 10 years? Do you think it's 30 years?
So what happens when there is this differential there is that one thing will catch very rapidly up with the other. And I don't think adoption is slowing. Therefore, price is going to accelerate in growth. So I've always maintained a view that Bitcoin is exponential in nature because adoption of technology is typically exponential. And money is even more foundational to civilization than basic things like a cell phone, right? So the adoption curve definitely should be approaching exponential. Now, exponential curves are very steep. So when you're predicting when it's going to happen, you think it's 5-10 years out, but because of that steepness of the curve, it's really difficult to say. Like, I think it's honestly going to be next year. At the most, the next year after that. So within 2 years, we'll start seeing that very steep exponential curve. And it's just suddenly is very sudden, and people will start to see it. Yeah, so this is a very interesting one. There's kind of two schools of thought out there. I would say one school of thought is like aligned with what I'm saying, which is Bitcoin will replace the dollar. And it's going to happen very quickly. People aren't going to expect it. And everything just gets priced into sats or Bitcoin. The other school of thought is, I guess, more the Saylor school of thought, which seems to believe in a coexistence. And some people that I've seen react to my posts online are very, very aggressively leaning towards this and denying the possibility that the dollar goes away. And it's hard to see these things happening, but I believe when fiat currencies fail, they just spectacularly fail. There is no real grace period because nobody wants it anymore at certain points, right? If I told you, Scott, I'll sell you 5,000 beaver pelts for dollars, would you want the beaver pelts if you don't need them? Would you take them as money? Probably not, right? So inferior monies just kind of disappear over time and stop being money, and they become either ornamental or collectibles or anything like that. So it reverts back to, a more proto money. And then the other part is, I guess, can the dollar fail? And I believe that is a part of this equation, because if you look at the debt right now, it's at 36 trillion, growing by $1 trillion a year. And that's going to accelerate because of the magic of compound interest. There's a school of thinking out there that the Department of Government Efficiency is going to fix this by cutting spending. But you can cut all the spending you want, but that debt is still going to compound at a remarkably fast rate. And compounding is a wonder of the world. So it's good if you're compounding positively, but if you're compounding debt, it's pretty bad. So the question really is, can the US get out of this debt spiral? At the same time, the world is sort of geopolitically moving away from the dollar. And you have countries adopting Bitcoin as money at the same time. So the interplay of these three things is really going to be the determining factor of whether or not the dollar continues. And I'm, again, in the camp that it's not going to last. And it's just going to change the Bitcoin very rapidly. But, I could be wrong. Maybe Saylor is right. And there is this coexistence. And you can see that coexistence in his Bitcoin 24 model. And what it is he tapers off growth at some point. I forgot where, but maybe after the 2030s. And then it's just kind of Bitcoin growth just stabilizes. And I think the assumption there is that it just coexists with the dollar indefinitely.
Like, no other company has really, there are companies holding Bitcoin on their balance sheet, but no one has really thought about emulating this strategy to anywhere near the scale that MicroStrategy is doing. What are your thoughts about that? What has prevented another, there are plenty of companies as capitalized as MicroStrategy. What's the holdup there?
We're seeing more now. You have Semler Scientific and a number of others starting to come out. And like you mentioned, Rumble too. So it is happening. I think MicroStrategy and Michael Saylor, they just have such a huge lead that it'll be difficult for any company to replicate that success with Bitcoin, because they just started at a point where nobody was doing it, and they were able to buy a lot of Bitcoin at very low prices. So I think more companies will be adopting Bitcoin as a reserve asset, because a lot of companies have cash flow and excess cash that is melting. So they will pick it up. But will another one reach MicroStrategy size? That's a really debatable point. It's even questionable whether the US can hit that 1 million coin target that they have, that Cynthia Lummis had in her bill to create that reserve. So I think definitely we're reaching the end of 2024 now, but 2025 is going to be the year of war to accumulate Bitcoin. Everyone's going to be trying to get it. You have nation states that are mining it and kept quiet a very long time and not told anybody because, of course, they want the advantage. But you're going to see more of that. More nation states just mining with excess energy that they have that would otherwise, turn to mush and be wasted. And you're going to have countries printing their own currency to buy it, I believe, because they see that there's no downside to it, right? You either print it to do useless things that add zero value, or you print it to buy Bitcoin. So just print it to buy Bitcoin. And then you're going to have public entities like the US and MicroStrategy rapidly accumulating. So there's just going to be all-out war to get your hands on a single Satoshi.
Without speculating on what countries may follow El Salvador, are you surprised that there has been this long in between El Salvador's announcement and whoever's coming next? Or is that, again, like there was really no way to know?
Well, I think there was a certain momentum that could have been taken advantage of once El Salvador announced, and we tried to push that hard. But at the same time, you're fighting inertia. So governments are typically not early adopters, right? Like, far from it, to put it politely. So you're dealing with very difficult to orange pill entities. And one of the things that was a miracle for El Salvador really was that they had a president that was a Bitcoiner, right? That's not the norm right now in most countries. I mean, you can argue about Trump, but he's more crypto than a Bitcoiner. Pierre Poilievre in Canada, he knows about Bitcoin, and I think he appreciates and understands Bitcoin, but he hasn't spoken much about Bitcoin in the past couple of years, actually. So it's a question mark on finding countries that have administrations or heads of state that understand it, and then getting them across the line to do something with it. So that's been a challenge, I think, and that's been slower than I had hoped. But at the same time, I feel it's accelerating again now because of the US. So a lot of countries look towards the US for leadership in many areas, and the ETFs are one such example. So Hong Kong and Australia, they didn't launch their ETFs until the SEC greenlit in the US, and then they went ahead with it. So I think if the Trump administration does create this strategic Bitcoin reserve that they're tabling and discussing and pushing for, then we'll start to see a massive cascade that more and more countries around the world are actually doing things. And you start to see a bit of this with the state level adoption of Bitcoin as a reserve asset, and other countries starting to talk about it now too. So it's all starting to really snowball. Well, I think it's a massive idea. And the abbreviations I picked were actually before Bitcoin and Anno Singulari. And then some people said you can also say it's after Satoshi. Both work, I think. But the reason I chose Anno Singulari is that it's like one Latin translation of a sovereign individual. And I think Satoshi, above all else, was a sovereign individual, beholden to no one, and no one can control him, manipulate him, and coerce him. And he gave us this gift of being capable of also being sovereign without having to give up give up our identities, right? So with the advent of Bitcoin, the reason why I think it's so significant is you can actually have your own money now versus the old system where there is an intermediary at all touch points. And even with metal-based monies like gold and silver, you have a minter of coins, and powers will centralize and control that process. Even when gold coins were prolific, at some point it became illegal to mint your own coins, right? There is the mint, and that is the group that gets to mint the coins. And of course, when you centralize power and control, they become corrupted and they start clipping and, mixing with other stuff. So with Bitcoin, you get rid of all these deficiencies in every single other monetary system that has ever been created in humanity. And it's such a base transformation of civilization. I think it warrants this new year scheme or calendar schema, because it just resets everything. So if you think about it, we always make new things, and we do them in a poor way, right? So the internet, one of the key deficiencies that I think we had was it wasn't encrypted by default, right? It's not secure by default, and we have to bolt on all these things. But the net effect is like internet is still not that secure these days. There's all these holes, and if you're not familiar or understand all the safety procedures or how to use it safely, then you can leak your information or leak whatever metadata about yourself too. But it's the same for money. It's all defective. And then suddenly we create this perfect money that fixes all those deficiencies. So I think it's an important milestone in terms of human civilization.